Hey everybody, it's actually really cool to be here and look out and see a load of friends in the audience that I haven't seen in person for 3 years. Also really cool to be at the very first LABSCon, so thank you very much to the SentinelOne crew for the invite. I have 20 minutes to give you a really quick run through some of basically an introduction to a threat actor that's come from potentially quite humble beginnings, running a bunch of phishing campaigns, etc., through to becoming probably one of the most prolific, most deeply connected, and most technically advanced actors around, and one that we actually consider a pretty significant superpower in this space now. So I'll dive straight into it. If you rewind probably for at least the last 10, maybe longer years, public blogs, white papers, private intelligence reporting, even DOJ indictments have laid bare the evidence for the existence of quartermaster relationships in the APT landscape. And even if you go back to like 2010, we had like Winty, PlugX, or actually even pre-2010 for some of those, they proliferated really, really widely. And actually they still do today. We see new actors popping up with some of those tool sets. But ones since then have been controlled probably with a little bit more formality in some ways. So if you take ShadowPad that first emerged in around 2015, actually SentinelOne did one of the best write-ups on the history of that so far. I think we track something like 13 distinct threat actors using ShadowPad now. And then if you move forward to 2018 when Crosswalk appeared, same developers behind it, that's being controlled even more tightly, so probably less than a handful of users behind it. And then Sidewalk and Spider, which is a sort of an adjacent actor in 2020, probably still used just by those groups, or maybe one or two other customers of them. So if you kind of map out the sort of trickle-down effect, you end up with something that looks a little bit like this over time. And while hunting for some of this stuff in 2021, I think it was, we came across a cluster of ShadowPad binaries that looked a little bit different than stuff that we had seen before. They had a really interesting loader or loading mechanism associated with it. And we couldn't connect that back to the barium infrastructure that we had tracked before, so the top line in this chart. And we assumed that it was probably then going to be a distinct actor. Now, that actor is one that I mentioned at the start, is now kind of one that we consider a superpower in this space. And actually, that technical link was what sort of let us separate out some of this cluster. So we actually blogged about a little bit of this, what we call the Scatterbee loader for ShadowPad back in, I think it was at some point last year. The first sample of that we could find from October 2020. The whole Scatterbee loader is basically typified by control flow obfuscation. So it pairs every legitimate assembly instruction with a call, and it figures out the address to that based on the subsequent D word to that. So it adds that in and then calls the offset of that. Which is what's highlighted here. There's also a stream cipher used in that ShadowPad instance. There were really two clusters of this. The first version used that stream cipher just about everywhere, and the same stream cipher was used in some of the internals of ShadowPad for previous years. And then there was a second version, or second cluster of that ShadowPad activity that swapped out some instances of that stream cipher implementation in the ShadowPad the Scatterbee loader for AES. And so we had those sort of two quite distinct versions of it. And then in August 2022, so just last month, somebody uploaded a version of ShadowPad that triggered all of our Scatterbee rules to VirusTotal, but it looked quite different. And actually, the first version of Scatterbee was always applied to DLLs and the payloads. This one was applied to an exe, and the payload was directly embedded in that exe. So the first layer of the Scatterbee kind of loader worked basically in the same way. It just decoded the second stage payload. The second stage, however, was quite different. So it had swapped out some of how it did those calculations. In this instance, it was taking the D word after some of the calls, then doing an extra step, so either an addition, a subtraction, or an exclusive OR operation against it with a hard-coded value, and then using that as the address to jump to. And on the right-hand side of this is just a quick example. They also did some other sort of conditional jump trickery in that version of it. So along with every legitimate conditional jump, they then added an illegitimate conditional jump straight afterwards, which meant that disassemblers basically couldn't figure out where the function boundaries were correctly. But once that was all decoded and you worked through the obfuscation, what dropped out at the back end of it was effectively a standard ShadowPad binary. And in this one, the C2 address was s3.iga.gay. There's also related infrastructure of CGA.1 associated with that. So if anybody's seen that in the wild, let me know, because the infrastructure looks a little bit different than some of the other stuff. But the interesting thing about this is, although the ShadowPad malware was scared, this scatterbee loading technique was quite unique. And whenever we had that, it then enabled us to go and try to link back up some other bits of activity. But the other interesting thing about it was it sort of proved that this group, who we call Red Scylla, Microsoft call Chromium, Trend Micro call Earth-Luska, and a few others call Fishmonger, and because of some of the PDB references, it proved they had access to the ShadowPad source code, because the way that the scatterbee loader works, and all of the control flow obfuscation stuff that it does, that's much easier to do when you've got the source code rather than afterwards, i.e. before the final assembly instructions are generated. So trying to then separate out this distinct actor from all of the other activity that was on the go was much easier now that we had that unique link to something that was distinctly theirs. And through 2020, or basically up until 2020, these guys have basically blended in with a lot of the ongoing kind of Winty, ShadowPad sort of activity, because they didn't really have a lot of distinct tooling themselves. But then for the last 18 months or so, industry's done a really good job at highlighting some of the stuff that they've been up to. So Avast published a really interesting blog about them backdooring a Mongolian certificate authority. Trellix have published stuff on them. Record a Future have talked about them targeting telecommunications companies, which I'll come back to in a little bit. And Trend Micro have obviously done a really in-depth paper on what they call Earth-Luska, which is fascinating in terms of some of the stuff that they've been doing. So they give an example of the actor injecting something into a victim's HR system that then served JavaScript that then served up a Trojanized Flash installer for some of the malware. So really interesting set of techniques in this space. So aside from that stuff that we've talked about, what else do these guys actually have up their sleeves in terms of technical capability? The answer is quite a lot. And I've kind of tried to break it out into a few categories. So we have shared implants, so PlugX, Winty, ShadowPad that we've talked about, the scatterbee loader for ShadowPad. We also have Cobalt Strike, which I've marked as stolen because I'm pretty sure they didn't pay for a license for it themselves. The interesting bit about the Cobalt Strike use is that the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK published a report on something called Jolly Jellyfish, which is basically a loader for the Cobalt Strike, and it decodes the payload out of an image through steganography, and then also downloads a legitimate PDF to display to that user as well, or that victim. They have the ability to customize some things, so they've taken the Trochilus implant, and Doraemon is actually a variant of some other open source things that they've tweaked a little bit, and then they've got some of this malware that is distinctly there. So Funny Switch, which is a .NET implant, and then Spider, which seems to be quite exclusive to them, and again used for quite high value targets. One other thing to throw in the mix, and just a little bit of a blast from the past. So in January 22, a military victim in Southeast Asia uploaded some files to VirusTotal, and there was effectively the result of a ShadowPad intrusion, but it was the scatterbee variant of ShadowPad, so we can link it to this specific actor. And then shortly after that, they also uploaded some other files, which are likely or were likely deployed before that ShadowPad intrusion. And they look very much like an updated version of the 9002 RAT. It's obviously using the VTCP library, same as Trochilus. And for the historians in the room, originally developed by WHG. And there are a few other things in that are quite interesting as well. So LZO and RC4 for C2 traffic, not very well implemented. There are some things like the fixed header from 9002 RAT that have been taken out of it as well. And again, we're not 100% sure this is the same actor, but the temporal proximity of the binary relative to the ShadowPad instance that we do know was the actor that we're talking about. Kind of interesting. So if anybody has seen this in the wild, please do let me know. So switching from binary capability to infrastructure, we could talk about this for a lot because these guys have a ton of infrastructure, but broadly it breaks into these three layers. So we have a kind of relay network at the top that is typically China or Hong Kong providers that they use for a lot of their activity. They use that to control then a layer of VPSs at like most of the major cloud providers or VPS providers. And then also they've got the kind of target layer at the bottom. Two interesting things about this, just to reference quickly. They actually do quite a lot of direct victim access and scanning from the top layer as opposed to the middle layer. So actually, they're not particularly good at segmenting some of what they do in this space. And then the second bit is we've seen them use a lot of ways of sort of backing off the traffic from the malware families, so sort of their edge nodes back up to some other system behind through a kind of VPN sort of proxy network. And this is a good example of it from just a few weeks ago in practice and how it's actually set up. So right at the very top layer, we've got some of their kind of exit points through South Korean IPs into Cloudy, an ISP in Hong Kong, used to manage DigitalOcean and Vulture IP addresses, then used to control ShadowPad, Spider, and PlugX as well. And actually those C2s, that IMGR imitation address, is all still live as well. And they actually have quite a lot of these. So they tend to segment things quite well as opposed to having like everything deeply interconnected. But not all of their infrastructure management is perfect. And we've got multiple instances of these guys leaving directories open, sort of misconfiguring things, or otherwise being just a little bit sloppy. And this is a directory listing from one of them that we pulled a little while ago. A couple of things to point out. You see a reference to IOX on that. So that's an open source tunneling solution. It defaults to port 9999. A lot of the traffic between layers on the previous diagram was also on 9999. And so we assume that's what IOX is one of the things that they're using to manage that, the tunnels between those different layers. The other is Soft Ether, which we've seen them use a lot over the last few months. We've seen SQL map output on some of these directories, and Trend Micro did a good job of documenting how they were doing that, how they were using SQL map for some SQL injection discovery. And then a couple of things that are quite important that I'll come back to later. There are 3 files in this associated with the Winty Linux implant. So there's the kind of hider module, there's the main implant, and then there's an install script for Winty Linux as well. And again, it's a quick screenshot from the Trend Micro report. They also had a GitHub profile, which is still live if anybody's interested in looking at it, albeit it's serving slightly different stuff. But at the time that Trend Micro took this screenshot, it was also serving the Winty Linux binaries and a few other things that they were using to then pull out of or pull into victim environments. So where are they using all of this capability? Short answer, just about everywhere. There is literally no threat actor that we track in 2020 that has or appears to have a more global remit than these guys. We're talking 35 plus countries just this year in terms of the remit. So it is everywhere from Brazil and South America to parts of Africa like Mozambique and Nigeria, where there might be sort of trade or financing or aid interests, through to India, through to big parts of Southeast Asia as well. Absolutely prolific. Sector-wise, it's also still really broad, but we can actually kind of refine that a little bit more. So we've got education, Hong Kong, Japan, Taiwan, bits of Switzerland, and so on. We've got government, so ministries of education, ministries of commerce, legislative departments, mix in that space, aerospace and defense, like a military organization in Afghanistan, aviation organization in Hong Kong, technology across Taiwan in particular, energy and utilities. Record of Future did a great kind of talk, I think it's TA22 they call them, about their targeting of the Indian utility companies. News and media has been a huge focus in the last 6 months across Taiwan and Europe. And then telecommunications, like many ShadowPad users, there is a big focus on telecommunications. And there's a reason that I have left that one to the very end. So I have a very bad habit of leaving probably more questions than answers in talks, and this one's probably going to be no different. But 3 years ago, I left a little bit of a teaser in a Kaspersky SaaS talk, which was about the prolific targeting of telecommunications companies by China-based APT actors. And I used this exact image to show a relationship through infrastructure between a group on the left-hand side called Deepcliff and a group on the right-hand side that was using the Winty Linux implant. And there was a clear overlap between these. Now, the email address from the left-hand side of that, the Deepcliff side of it, girder1992@hotmail.com, can be connected in a whole ton of different ways. And actually, Recorded Future have done some work in this space as well, into what they call Red Alpha. That could be connected to a profile called Liang Xiaodong, whose Twitter account, Evil Liang, puts him in Chengdu in 2017. That gives up a whole load of other email addresses. That sort of girder term and the Liang term is prolific through that. It also gives us 2 public blog sites that he ran, SecBus and Liang1234.com, and some other deep cliff infrastructure. There's Drive Mail Google, Drive Accounts Google, and a few other bits. Combination of data breach info and pivoting on who is data gives up 2 key bits of info about that. Another QQ address that is specific to him, and a password of loves Liang. That new QQ address can also be connected to profiles, again through data breaches and other things, to Liner CN and Liner SS. Those can be connected to other email addresses, and the passwords associated with those email addresses also keep giving up the same references to Liang and loves in the password. Liner CN can also be connected to linercn.org. That happened to be one of only 2 domains that were linked to from a 2010 version, or the very earliest version of a website called isoon.net. The other website linked to from there was lengmo.net, run by somebody called Apathy Boy, or using the handle Apathy, and the email address lengmo@live.com. That email address also ran a profile called wolfexp. wolfexp.net is associated with that, and crst.com.cn, which is the C Rufus security team. Many of you, if you've looked at CNAPT, will know that was the original home of GhostNet, and Chandai Lin, the 2019 indictment into barium named him, was one of the early members of that. So you can kind of see lots of connections from this one individual associated with this campaign back into that ecosystem. And the first reference to isoon.net, that'll be quite important. So back out to that deep cliff infrastructure, loads of those domains have sort of migrated across various IP addresses. We have this 4.3 IP on the left that had these 2 domains that then moved over to a 107 IP address. Within a day of that change happening, 3 other things started resolving there. We have this Gmail isooncloud.com, Gmail app.me, and gf.mk. Gmail isooncloud.com was registered by the same person that registered idatabases.com, which is a company that is wholly owned by something called Shanghai Isoon Information Technology Co. Limited. And the contact point for that is chao.ting.ting@isoon.net. Now, wild pivot coming up. That email address is associated with a system that had a credential stealing Trojan on it. And at the point that credential stealing Trojan was there, it was assigned 2 IP addresses that put it in Chengdu and Leshan, both Sichuan province. It also gives us up a load of other email addresses. So you can see idatabases.com, isoon.net, and another QQ address. And it also gave us a whole load of other sites that were accessed from that system and had credentials stored. Some of them were corporate sites, like the iSoon sites. Some of them were threat intel sites, like passport.threatbook.cn. And some of them were actual malicious infrastructure, like a Cobalt Strike server. They also had a GitHub profile. Weirdly, the system name for this was Atlas, the system owner name was Atlas. The profile picture on the GitHub account was of Atlas Corporation from Call of Duty. If any of you know Call of Duty, that was a private military contractor that became the largest company in the world. But this company is not the largest company in the world. They do, however, have a very good corporate website that gives a really interesting history, which I'll just touch on briefly because we've done a little bit of translation. In 2010, the company was established. They then shortly after that set up a security research department and what translates as a APT network penetration department. So I guess maybe their own threat intel function. They then launched an R&D center. They got some financing. They joined an accredited supplier list for the Ministry of State Security. They had another financing round, launched what is now one of the largest CTFs in China, were commended by leaders of the central government and the Ministry of Public Security. Shortly after that, launched the iSoon Institute, which is tightly linked to some national strategic security objectives, and also received what I can only assume is a kind of classification accreditation. So it translates as a confidentiality qualification for scientific research and production of weapons and equipment. And then they got listed in Sichuan's top 30 cyber companies. One final link on this. So in 2019, Citizen Lab published a report which they called Poison Carp, or the malware called Poison Carp, which was about iOS and Android zero-day exploitation of high-value targets in the Tibetan community. One of the other domains that resolved to that 107 IP address that had the iSoon Cloud domain is gmailapp.me. That was listed as a high-confidence IOC in that campaign as well. So we pull all of this sort of stuff together. Where does that kind of leave us? So a quick dive-in reference model for any of the fans in the room. Right-hand side, we've got capability across Windows, Linux, and mobile, if you consider the poison corp side of things in that. We've shared and bespoke malware, lots of access to kind of tightly controlled tooling. We have a really broad vector set in terms of watering holes, Trojanized updates, phishing campaigns, vulnerability scanning, which they do from some of the infrastructure using Acunetics vulnerability scanning tool. We have a huge spread of victims, tons of infrastructure, and effectively that gives us an actor with a really rapid operational tempo, capable of sustaining a lot of intrusions at scale, deeply technically proficient, deeply connected, so both the intrusion operators and the company domain registrants can be showed through QQ, leak membership, et cetera, to have 15 plus years of intimate involvement in the local hacking scene, particularly in Chengdu. Globally impactful, like I said, they have the broadest remit of any active threat actor that we track at the minute, and multiple associations across lots of different areas, and I haven't mentioned them all here, to a company called Shanghai Isun Technology Co. So the clock has just hit 0. That is all I can pack into 20 minutes, so I will stop there.